Hello, everyone. Welcome to this IEA webinar on policy preparedness for the climate resilience of the energy sector as part of London Climate Week. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for a few additional people to join, and we'll get started soon. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're following us from. Welcome to this IEA webinar on policy preparedness for climate resilience of the energy sector. So my name is Sarah Morif. I head the Environment and Climate Change Unit at the IEA, which is the team in which the work we're doing on energy sector resilience is based. And I'll just be moderating the webinar today. Before we begin, I just want everyone to be aware that we're recording the webinar, and we will hope to share the video after the event shortly. So our aim with this webinar is really to have speakers from different types of organizations, some working at government levels, some at international levels, some more with corporate clients and other types of organizations, to really think about building climate resilient energy systems, what's experience that people have had, what are some findings, some practices, and really just have a discussion, to really raise awareness on the importance of this, and something we really are seeing and feeling strongly on the importance of climate resilience in the energy system, and really developing effective policy measures to really build these systems, which is, again, another thing that's important to tackle. So the way the webinar will be run today is we'll have some opening remarks from the IEA side. Then we have a really excellent panel, and each panelist will be giving a short presentation of their views, their thoughts, their insights, sharing some of the things they've learned and have been researching. We'll have a bit of a discussion within the panel, and then we'll open the floor to the audience and to questions that you have for them as well. So just to start, for giving a little bit of a welcome and an opening, I'll invite Mr. Tom House, who's the head of the Energy and Environment Division here at the IEA, leading work on energy and climate issues, including IEA's engagement at COP26 and a range of international climate initiatives. And in the past, he's worked on quite a broad range of energy and climate policies for the Australian government, the UK government, and the European Commission. So I'll give the floor to you, Tom.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello to everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us at today's webinar. Climate resilience, I guess it's a topic that's been around for quite some time, but it's been going up the agenda as people's awareness of climate issues and climate change has grown also over the last decades. In terms of weather events, we're hitting one of the warmest decades on history. Extreme weather events of wildfires and cyclones, floods and droughts, and even freezing periods are becoming, if you like, a new normal. And the risk of climate hazards has been growing around the country, around the world. So for that reason, it's been going up the policy agenda and the energy sector agenda, and it's worth looking at from an energy sector perspective. At the moment, climate change is a growing realization of the significant risk it poses, because it can directly affect the fuel supplies, energy infrastructure, energy production, as well as energy demand. So in multiple ways, it has a critical impact on the sector. Whether we're talking about the electricity outages that come from heat waves in California, wildfires in Australia, cyclones in Japan and Korea, these all demonstrate that the system, our energy systems, have a vulnerability which we need to ensure against. And so these climate hazards, they not only test the resilience of our energy systems, but they can clearly impose significant economic, political, and social impacts on all of us. So for multiple reasons, there's a need to address the nexus of climate resilience with the energy sector. The other thing to bear in mind in all of this is that building in climate resilience to the energy system is the cost-effective way to address energy security and concerns from this perspective. So ensuring that the energy system can withstand the long-term changes in climate and the immediate shocks from extreme weather events. It also enables us to ensure that we address issues of energy access in vulnerable countries as well, and ensuring the clean energy transition. So there's a lot of different factors there to bring together. There's our existing energy needs of addressing energy access in the clean energy transition, and doing that in a way that we build up the resilience of the energy system to climate shocks and reduce its vulnerabilities. And to look at all of these different factors, the IEA has been contributing through its analysis and its data, building up and enhancing climate resilience in energy systems. We've been producing some robust analyses and reports and collaborating with a wide range of stakeholders to ensure that we address all the relevant aspects in tackling this issue. We've recently published earlier this year the IEA Electricity Security Report, and this highlights the importance of climate resilience in terms of energy security and gives step-by-step guidance for decision makers on how to incorporate these factors into our energy system planning. The series of climate impacts on hydropower report provides a comprehensive assessment of hydropower plants in particular, and comparing different climate scenarios and hydrological models. So bringing in these different worlds of energy sector modeling, hydrological modeling, and seeing how these different analytical tools can help us take forward the analysis and lead to useful and interesting policy answers and applications. So from all of these different projects, we found that national policies can send a very clear signal to the energy sector. Policy measures for climate resilience can encourage stakeholders to incorporate climate consideration into their planning and into their operation. And the last one of the most recent things we've just launched is the IEA's Climate Resilience Policy Indicator. Launching this today to show that the IEA's continued support for the topic and to bring multiple different tools for policymakers to be able to understand what's going on in this nexus and to address it. The indicators are still at an initial stage, but it aims to contribute to mainstreaming climate resilience in key policies and mobilizing for concrete actions. So there's a lot to bring together in this field, and we're trying to do that, and grateful for the collaboration we've had with stakeholders, some of whom are in today's webinar. So I hope this virtual event provides an interesting opportunity for everyone to get an understanding of some of these different relationships and to discuss ongoing efforts for climate resilience in the energy sector and to explore future solutions. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for sort of highlighting, the risk perspective, the challenge to the sector, and really sort of viewing the importance of this issue from both an energy security lens and an energy transition lens and access and development lens, and sort of the idea of the multiple benefits that we get from these resilient systems and how important they are, and the work we've done to date. And so Tom mentioned that today we've actually launched a new sort of report and a new sort of set of reports actually that we'll be hopefully keeping going, really trying to understand policy and how can we think about resilience and energy policy and try and find ways of looking at them and understanding what's working, and what can be improved from a very much a national government perspective. So I'll invite Jinsun Lim, who's an energy and environment policy analyst who's been leading this work within the IEA and work on climate resilience of the energy sector more broadly in the IEA. So she'll be giving a very short introduction now on this new climate resilience policy indicator. So I'll pass the floor to you, Jinsun.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Could you show my presentation? Okay. I'm Jinsun Lim. I'm an energy and environment policy analyst at the IEA. So today I would like to share our newest work on climate resilience, IEA Climate Resilience Policy Indicator. So over the past decades, the number of climate-related anomalies has increased, as we all know, and climate hazards are set to grow throughout the rest of the century. Average global temperature have risen consistently in the past few decades, and the trend is expected to continue. Many countries are experiencing more extreme weather events such as floods, droughts, and tropical cyclones. The graph shows the aggregated level of climate hazard in 4 areas: warming, flood, droughts, and tropical cyclones for IEA member and association countries. It was assessed based on the IEA Weather for Energy Tracker database and the Inform Risk Index. As you can see, over 85% of the countries in the IEA member and association countries are already exposed to a medium or high level of climate hazard risks. Particularly, you can see India, Mexico, China are ranked highest. Of course, since the assessment does not cover all types of climate hazards such as sea level rise and melting glaciers, we didn't really take a look at it. And other aspects of climate risk exposure and vulnerability, we couldn't cover it. So the assessment may have limitations in capturing the full picture of climate risk for each country. But I just want to highlight that it gives a good understanding as a starting point which countries are more exposed to climate hazards than others. So now you can see that how the countries ranked high in terms of climate hazard are taking role in terms of population, total energy supply, and total final energy consumption. These 3 countries, which are highest ranked in terms of climate hazard, are home to over 2.9 billion people, which accounts for 38% of the world population and 62% of total population of IEA member and association countries. In addition, if we consider all the countries ranked red and orange, high and medium high, in terms of overall climate hazard accounts for 53% of the world population and 86% of the total population of IEA member and association countries. It is also notable that a majority of energy supply and consumption comes from these countries with high or medium high level of climate hazard. These countries account for around 80% of the total energy supply and total final energy consumption of IEA member and association countries, which is also equivalent to 57% and 55% of the world's total energy supply and final energy consumption, respectively. So climate resilient energy systems actually support many different aspects. Clean energy transitions by addressing adverse impacts of climate change on renewable energy, and also it promotes sustainable development by ensuring reliable energy services. It also boosts energy security through coping with climate-driven disruptions and reducing risks from climate disasters. To build climate resilience, policies have a critical role to play. Although energy providers have a direct interest in protecting their own asset and their customers, but the true cost of the foregoing climate resilience measures may not be accurately understood. As you can imagine, when a climate-driven disruption happens, the significant socio-economic cost will happen, and also it will spread across society, while energy providers bear only a fraction of the cost. Effective policy measures are needed to ensure not only reliable energy supply, but also reduce those socio-economic costs and protect vulnerable groups. So this time in our report, we looked at how climate resilient energy systems can protect vulnerable groups. We found that a climate resilient energy system protects the health of children and the elderly against the harmful effects of increasing temperature and heat waves. You can imagine that extreme heat can cause health problems such as heat strokes and gastrointestinal infections, with a higher mortality rate for children under 5-year-olds and the elderly over 65-year-olds. Enhancing climate resilience of energy supply also help indigenous communities manage the impacts of climate change. Many of indigenous communities rely on small-scale, fossil fuel energy systems that are prone to frequent supply disruptions and outages from extreme weather events. These communities are sensitive to the fluctuation in diesel prices, while climate change could affect diesel production and safety in their transportation. Another thing is about the gender equality. So climate resilient energy system supports gender equality in some countries. A lower level of education among women than men in some places makes them more vulnerable to climate risk due to the limited access to weather information and adaptive capacity building. In addition, extreme weather events such as droughts and floods force women and girls to spend more time securing water and fuel, which is traditionally considered the responsibility of women in some countries. So a climate resilient energy system which can support those cooking and water pumping and heating during extreme weather events can improve the gender equality as well. So we believe that mainstreaming climate resilience in energy systems through national energy and climate plans is the first step. Addressing energy sector climate resilience in high-level policy discussions can initiate and activate discussions on this. On today's report, we assessed the level of policy preparedness of IE member and association countries, focusing on their national energy and climate plans. Examine whether national energy and climate plans emphasize climate resilience of the energy sector, whether they provide concrete action plans for implementation, and whether the proposed action plans are consistent between these two plans. Based on the responses to these questions, we categorize policy preparedness level into 4 categories: high, medium, low, and low. From this assessment, we found that in around 75% of IEA member and association countries, climate resilience of the energy sector is already covered in at least one of their national energy and climate plans as a priority with concrete actions. However, around a quarter of IE member and association countries do not have a national climate or energy plan that focuses on the climate resilience of energy systems. But actually, it does not really mean that these countries are not interested in climate change adaptation or energy sector's climate change resilience, because most of them have concrete adaptation plans for other sectors, for example, agriculture and water, and measures for climate change mitigation, particularly about decarbonization of the energy sector in their national energy plans. However, still the actions for adaptation and resilience in the energy sector is sometimes missing in some countries. So therefore, we wanted to look at the comparison of the climate hazard level and policy preparedness level of the IE member and association countries. Of course, we note that the urgency and necessity for climate resilience measures vary among countries, since every country is exposed to the different level of climate risk. A country with a high level of climate hazard should consider prioritizing climate resilience measures, while a country with a low level of climate hazard may pay less attention to this issue. So climate resilience policy indicator launched today is an initial effort to assess the level of climate resilience of each country by comparing the level of climate hazard that the country is facing against its policy preparedness. It shows that half of the IA member and association countries are ranked excellent or good in terms of climate resilience policy. In particular, 16% of the IA member and association countries, including Ireland, Italy, Norway, Spain, and UK, are estimated to be highly prepared in accordance with the level of climate risk they face. However, around 30% of IA member and association countries are insufficiently prepared against climate risks and ranked weak or inadequate. Countries that have yet to consider climate resilience in their national energy and climate plans, we would like to suggest they need to consider climate resilience against the significant level of climate hazard which might happen in the future. So you can find a full article on IA website. So I'm happy to discuss it further in our Q&A discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Jinsen. Hopefully that gave people a bit of an overview of the exercise and what we're trying to start doing and what we'll be building on going forward as well, looking at trying to understand how energy and climate policy from the adaptation side can be better integrated. And so now we're going to move on to our panel discussion. We have 5 really excellent panelists. That I'm quite excited to hear the discussion. I'll introduce each one in turn before they make their brief presentation. So I'll first start with a country case, and I'll introduce Ms. Lorena Prado Orcoyan, who's a technical advisor at the Spanish Office of Climate Change within the Ministry for Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge. So Lorena Orcoyan is an engineer. She's been working with the Spanish state administration since 2008 and has worked in a range of different roles and is currently really working on supporting activities related to energy transition, planning and measures. And so very, very pleased to have you here, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay.
Very well, thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Could you please show my presentation? First, thank you very much for inviting me to this timely webinar. And let me share with you the policy preparedness for climate resilience of the energy sector in Spain that I will tell you about in the next minutes. Spain is one of the European countries, although the slides shown before, Spain is one of the European countries with the highest economic losses caused by climate-related events in the last 2 decades. Increasing droughts, biodiversity loss, forest fires, coastal flooding, and heat waves rank Spain in the top 3 most vulnerable EU member states. To give you an idea about the growing extreme weather in Spain, if you can show the first slides, thanks. No, the other, the first. Yeah. I was telling you that to give you an idea about the growing extreme weather in Spain, I live in a little village in the central Spain where the climate is almost desert. However, the woman you can see in the picture is me near my house last January after the heaviest snowfall ever seen here that was called Filomena. We are completely aware of our growing exposure to climate change, and thus the assessment of vulnerability, impacts, and risks associated to climate change in Spain has accumulated more than 15 years of experience since the first National Adaptation Plan was launched in 2006. This plan is our reference tool for the coordination of public administration's efforts in adaptation to climate change in the different sectors that are potentially affected, that is water management, agriculture, forests, biodiversity, health, tourism, and of course, energy. You can now move to the next slide, please. So the National Adaptation Plan has been recently updated to focus on the period 2021-2030 and revolves around the conviction that mitigation and adaptation are two complementary strategies, even more obvious in the energy sector. Spain has a high potential for renewable resources, which places us in advantageous position for the transition towards a low emission energy system. In fact, our objective is increasing the share of renewable energy in the final energy consumption to 42%, with a 74% of renewable energy in electricity generation by 2030. Objectives that are completely aligned with achieving climate neutrality by 2050. However, the potential impacts of climate change throughout this transition process need to be considered. Projections in Spain point to increases in the average temperature, reduction of water resources, more frequent and intense droughts and floods, heat waves, coastal phenomena. All that could affect energy resources availability and good performance of installations. These changes may have significant impacts on the projected energy model, so that for us it is essential to analyze and quantify them. Thus, the priority objectives in the energy sector are improving knowledge on the impacts on climate change, on the availability of renewable energies, the resilience of energy generation, transmission, storage, and distribution systems, the changes in energy demand, as well as identifying risks derived from extreme events in critical energy infrastructures. So the final objective is to guarantee a resilient energy system in a scenario of prompt decarbonization. So after gathering all this information, we should address the key actions to reduce the associated risks and integrate them into energy planning, specifically in the future National Energy and Climate Plan. Next slide, please. And to achieve these objectives, we have foreseen 4 main lines of action. The first is to study the changes in primary energy supply, for example, developing projections of biomass potential by type of crop and by region for different climate change scenarios. The second is studying the impacts on electricity generation, for example, developing developing projections for of availability of water resources and their generation potentials by river basin. The third is preventing the impacts on energy transmission, storage, and distribution. As recent storms have demonstrated, they can damage essential energy infrastructures, and also in this sense, rising sea levels should be considered. For improving the management of the changes in electricity demand. Scenarios point to an increase in the number of days per year with high temperatures that will lead to increased peak electricity demand associated with cooling needs. So our target is with these lines of action integrated then into the National Adaptation Plan work programs that we are working now, and the results of the conclusions taken into account and be considered into the subsequent National Integrated Energy and Climate Plan. And that's all from my side. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I mean, Spain's really in terms of our member countries, has been a really great example, and was a very good example when we were looking at this project and trying to understand how countries were integrating these issues. So it's really great to hear you outline that and really highlight that the idea is then like, well, how do we translate those into planning decisions and having mechanisms for that, and it's really really very interesting. So I'll pass on to our next panelist, and then we'll be able to have a discussion afterwards. So our next speaker is Abhinash Mohanty. He's a program lead for risks and adaptation at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW. So he leads climate risk research at the council, really looking at decision making and toolkits for policy making, really around sort of climate risk, sustainability, environmental resource management. Has done quite a lot of experience looking at a range of issues related to climate risks, including water management, including financing issues. So we're very, very pleased to have Abhinash Mohanty with us to talk us a little bit about these risks and these efforts in India. So I'll give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So first of all, congratulations, IEA, for launching this very timely study. I hope my screen is visible and full. Yeah, perfect. So let's get started. As I said, this is quite timely, and I'm thrilled because a lot of discussions have been around whether to look at energy sector from a mitigation or from an adaptation. And this sets the context that mitigation and adaptations can't be looked in silos. Rather, we need to look at them from a co-benefit perspective. And that is why this discussion is quite timely. Let me just give you a brief. So I am from Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is Asia's one of the leading not-for-profit policy research institutions. The council uses data integrated analysis, strategic outreach to explain and change the use, reuse, and misuse of resources. And before we deep dive into what exactly are we talking about today, let me just take a pause, and let's all of us, in fact, take a pause and have a silent kind of glance about what exactly 2020 and 2021 all about. A pandemic, once in a century pandemic that struck us, that thrilled our and overwhelmed all of our infrastructures and basically our way of living. But what meddled more and what created the double whammy of tail end risk, the context of tail end risk, which have low probability, but whenever it hits, it hits high and enough. And within the course of pandemic, we experienced a swamp of locust swarms. We experienced some ravaging cyclones across the eastern and western coast. And at the same time, floods, heat waves, and whatnot. And even we experienced polar vortex. Now, with all of these extreme events, which we see that these are devastating and ravaging, the first thing that is hit is lives and livelihood. And lives and livelihoods are first of all hit because our power sector or the energy sector has been disrupted heavily. And this is where the context is quite pertinent, that we need to climate proof our energy sector more than ever because the context of tail end risk are rising. A brief background about what India looks like. India is the 5th most vulnerable country, and also India has suffered some hard infrastructure as well as hard losses in terms of INR 5.6 lakh crores, and more than 36 million Indians are at risk of flooding by 2050. And at the same time, India's major economic boosting sector, which comes from the coastal ports and others, are also been at the stake. But what has also happened is India's thought leadership across the climate resilience has also grown by many folds. India has led globally the action of being signatory to the Delhi Declarations and a framework, and India leads thought leadership of forming the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And my friend from CDRI, Samir, is going to, of course, going to present a lot more about what exactly is going to happen. But all of this, what mandate is a comprehensive risk assessment and identifying of the risk. Similarly, there is no denial. Nowadays, we used to struggle a lot in terms of whether climate action should be prioritized or reprioritized. And I don't think even in this, WAMEDA sets the context that climate actions are important. And in terms of livelihood globally, the World Economic Forum survey, perception survey actually highlights that extreme weathers are one of the highly likelihood risks that by likelihood as well as by impact are in the top of the list. This is what India looks like. I don't want to frighten anyone. I don't want to overwhelm anyone, but this is what is the practical picture of extreme events in India. In 2020 December, we released the first of its kind hazard assessment study as part of our climate risk atlas, where we want to identify the risk, and more than 75% of Indian districts are at risk of extreme events, extreme climatic events, which include cyclones, drought, flood, cyclone and drought, flood and cyclone, and flood and drought as well. So with 75% of your districts, your energy infrastructures, your energy facilities, and your energy assets are going to be placed somewhere in this colored map that I'm just presenting. Are we prepared? That's the big question. And as we move on, let's get into from climate proofing our energy infrastructure to the demand side and the supply side. This map shows how climate change has impacted India in last 50 years. What has happened is there is a swapping trend. More than 40% of the Indian districts are showcasing a swapping trend where flood used to traditionally hit them are now becoming drought prone, and drought prone areas are becoming flood prone. And this is alarming. And this alarming leads to an energy demand that creates. And of course, once you overlay all of this with the extreme heat wave conditions or the cold wave conditions, heat wave is more pertinent, but this is where we look at India. So all I would say is hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And how do we prepare for the worst? So what I'm going to present is a 6-eye framework of policy that is required in terms of making the energy sector more resilient. First is identifying the risk. Second is inclusiveness, and Jen in her presentation included the gender equality as one of the pillars of the indicators that have been considered. But it's not just about genders. We also need to look at the vulnerable populations, and vulnerable populations are not just based on economic strata, because one thing that pandemic has made us learn is whether you are rich, whether you are poor, or whether you are economically viable, your accessibility and you are at risk, right? And that is dependent on major things. So inclusiveness is more important. You need to take all the stakeholders into perspective, and then you need innovations. Innovations which are multi-layered, system innovations, system innovations, when I say it refers to the policy innovations, those are required, and what we will be discussing in our plenary, and then the technological innovations as well. In terms of technological innovations, India is again leading and has a very high ambition of getting into renewables, right? But is our renewable energy infrastructures climate proofed? We are ongoing with a study where we are trying to understand the wind variability across India in a changing climate perspective. And not to our surprise, our wind generation has significantly come down because of climatic impacts. And this is where it's a lag, and we never talk of this. And not to our surprise, this study, when we initiated it, there was a lot of interest from the industry partners to undertake this study and provide that empirical evidence of where exactly the pattern is changing, how is it's changing, and how is it going to impact the industry in short-term time frame. And then once you identify, make it quite inclusive and get your innovations in place, you need the right kind of investment. When I say right kind of investment, it's again not to be looked at from the purview of assets or infrastructure, but from a sector by large and accessibility, as well as in terms of climate proofing the sector. Then you need to intervene. You need to create those case studies and implement them at larger sectors. I'm sure CDRI is going to present one of their studies that they have tried looking at the power sector resilience in Odisha. I'm sure Samir would be talking about that. So those kind of interventions can actually be identified and then scaled up across, not just within countries, but across the vulnerable other SIDS developing countries or the geography, and that's what is more important. And then the first or the last I that I'm going to refer to is the integration. We have, like in India, more than half a dozen of policies, and all of these policies are quite good. But none of them has an integration. None of them actually converge with each other. Our DRR policies move in silos, our state action plans or the national action plans move in silos, and energy and water nexus is the only common link that binds all of this together. And it is high time when our policies needs to be inclusive and taken into consideration to create that climate proofing of energy sector. And then, of course, development, practice, policy, and outcomes shape disaster risk. But what we take forward is actually a matter of concern. And before I say and render my thanks, all I want to say is the presentation where I showed the Indian hotspots and the extreme event hotspots is actually a resultant of 0.6 degree rise. And all of us are talking of in terms of limiting our 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrades, right? This sounds alarming, but at 0.6 degree, we are somewhere struggling a lot and crippling, and we don't know how catastrophic the shape is. So we need to rethink, reorient, and probably re-strategize to a greater extent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Abhinash. That was really, really striking, very clear, and I think, yeah, I mean, India also being an NIE association country, it's definitely, as you say, because of the sort of hazard and the risk exposure. But I think what's interesting is it's also is combined with leadership, which, you know, I suppose makes sense, but it's not always a given that you do have that combination of things. And I think it's very interesting for other countries, you know, as we're looking into future trajectories and people, countries probably experiencing increasing levels of hazards and exposure, to try and really learn from also how our countries that are really quite vulnerable even now to the changes we've seen up to date, how are they thinking and planning, and this emphasis on integration is, you know, hopefully as an International Energy Agency, an area where we will hopefully you know, help bring those discussions forward, where, you know, get these cross sectoral, cross ministry discussions happening. So speaking of which, I think we'll move to another national perspective now as well, to Korea, another country that has quite a bit of experience in extreme events and trying to manage these risks, to Dr. Hannah Cho. She's currently a research fellow at the Korea Adaptation Center for Climate Change within the Korea Environment Institute. She's been with the Korea Environment Institute since 2006 and has been doing a lot of work on climate change adaptation, focused a lot on really strengthening capacity of industry sector as well for climate change, and done a lot of assessments of climate risks in industry, supporting action plans based on the results of those. So really very pleased to have you, Dr. Cho, so I will give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this meaningful event. My name is Hannah Cho from Korea Adaptation Center for Climate Change in Korea Environment Institute. And KACCC, the Korea Adaptation Center for Climate Change, carrying out a strategic research related to climate change adaptation and assisting in implementing plans for climate change adaptation in the national and local levels. And KACCC aims to enhance the climate resilience, the whole social sector across the country. For 5 years, based on the Climate Change Response Master Plan. Last year, the third National Climate Change Adaptation Plan was established, and detailed plans will be implemented for this year to 25 years. For the energy sector, the difference between the second and third plan is clear in Korea. In the second National Climate Change Adaptation Plan, only energy demand and supply in consideration of climate change was discussed. But in the third National Climate Change Adaptation Plan, the energy sector has established itself as a sector and is being dealt with importance. The reason of focusing energy sector is that we have recognized the growing risk of climate change in the energy sector. The risk of climate change in energy sector in Korea include the decrease in the efficiency of power and substation facility due to a rise in temperature, heat wave, and heavy rain, etc. And the increased using of heating and cooling energy due to heat wave and cold wave. There is a high risk of power blackout due to the heat wave and cold wave. In addition, we have risks such as damage to solar power generation facility due to strong wind and typhoon, and weakened stability of power plant due to tsunami and sea level rise, and water shortage for cooling process of power generation due to drought. In order to reduce these various risks, several actions has been established nationally. First of all, the government focused on strengthening the power equipment. We strengthened the safety standard for power generation facility in consideration of natural disaster. Also, we check power supply facility to reduce the risk of summer power peak blackout. A smart power grid and renewable energy integrated control system will be established to secure stability of power supply and demand. Second, increase energy efficiency. Government will prepare measures to strengthen response to abnormal climate and prepare guidelines for energy reduction design. Those can use in building, planning, or design. Third, diverse energy source. In order to disperse the concentration of electricity, the installation non-electric cooling facility has been supported, and the use of energy such as unused waste heat and liquefied natural gas has been expanded. It will introduce a benefit sharing new and renewable energy project with the participation of public, and support new and renewable energy facility in-house and shopping malls. Lastly, climate change adaptation plans are being established for public institutions that manage or have own social infrastructure. It includes several different types of power plants. Each energy power plant identify their risk and climate change that may occur depending on the location and type, and establish a plan. Currently, it is being done voluntarily, but it will be legally implemented soon. The South Korea government has recently become more interested in energy sector resilience to climate change and is working toward it. So far, I have shared Korea case briefly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. It's very interesting to see, I guess reassuring in a way, or nice to see that, as awareness of risk and understanding these impacts are increasing changes, then you do see a shift in the way things are addressed in policy documents, and you are seeing shifts in sort of the degree and the scale of which it's being managed from a policy perspective. So that's very interesting to see. Even trying to make a currently voluntary processes actually have to become mandatory. And I suspect I think that's very interesting to share. I think this is probably something other countries will be experiencing and dealing with as they go forward in terms of how do they adapt their policy response. So thank you very much for sharing. Our next speaker will come more from an international organization perspective, perhaps. Abhinash Mahati mentioned India led in creating the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI. And our next speaker is a senior specialist at CDRI, and he's really leading CDRI's power sector resilience program. He has a lot of experience in the field of disaster response and recovery, disaster risk reduction, infrastructure resilience, and really engaged with quite a wide variety of different actors at different levels. And recently he's really focused on climate and disaster resilience of energy systems. So very, very pleased to have you, Mr. Samir Pete, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you. Am I audible? I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible. Thank you.
So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining from across the world. I'd like to thank firstly IEA for hosting this event. So as I'm Samir Pete, working as senior specialist at the CDRI, and I'm leading the National Resilience Sector, Power Sector Resilience Program. For those who are not aware, CDRI is a global partnership bringing together nations and organizations from around the world to address the impacts of climate change and disasters and promote the resilience of infrastructure systems. So with 24 member countries and 7 international organizations, CDRI is contributing to climate action through its work on adaptation and resilience by serving as a platform to facilitate collaboration between member countries. We're working on improving access to technical support, promoting research and knowledge management, and improving knowledge sharing on infrastructure resilience through our platform. So coming to the topic at hand, reliable electricity supply underpins almost all social and economic activity in the world these days. The Global Infrastructure Hub report on infrastructure outlook estimates that US dollars 31 trillion will have to be invested in the energy sector by 2040 to achieve the SDGs and also to support the rising energy demand. So meanwhile, international commitments on climate change are leading to rapid transitions in both the generation and distribution of power. As was found in the IEA study, almost all the CDRI members have defined national plans and policies and are aiming to achieve net zero in their given timeline. But this massive investment in energy systems will obviously be threatened by natural hazards, both geological and climate-based. And transitioning to green sources of energy will not guarantee our survival of these systems against extreme events. For example, we can take an example of Kochi Airport in India, which was widely recognized for switching to fully solar power. But heavier than usual rains for 2 years in a row basically inundated the solar panels, and the airport had to switch back to grid power and reconsider their options. So this example also helps us to highlight how past flood levels were not a good guide for the recent events, which demonstrates the deep uncertainty within which we're making these decisions right now. So CDRI's position currently is that irrespective of the technology choices, all investments in energy infrastructure must account for disaster risks and future climate projections. So as we know that about 80% of the risk in a project gets locked in during the design phase. So it's vital to work with the upstream decision makers and support them to develop the policies, strategies, and frameworks that recognize disaster and climate risks and also guide downstream actions towards climate resilience. So on the whole, power infrastructure comprises a variety of components, all networked together. These are all differentially susceptible to a variety of natural hazards. So the vulnerability of the whole system is not just a sum of its parts. And so this leads us to take a network-based lens to resilience and also a systems approach, considering the interdependence and interconnectedness of power infrastructure with other infrastructure systems. So CDRI has been rolling out projects to inform and encourage CDRI member countries on strengthening national preparedness and capacities for climate and disaster resilient infrastructure. One such project that we've initiated is the power sector study in Orissa state in India. The increasing frequency and intensity of cyclones has been evident in this state, which has been hit by a cyclone almost every year in the last 5 years. So CDRI is working with the state to create a roadmap to achieve climate and disaster resilience in terms of improving preparedness, recommending climate resilient standards, and also addressing the governance, policies, capacities, and knowledge required to achieve this roadmap. In conclusion, basically, CDRI aims to actively support countries to develop climate and disaster resilient energy systems. And CDRI aims to serve as the platform through which we can engage with global policy makers, decision makers, and facilitate collaborations between member countries with an aim to nudge the high level policy towards resilience. I'll stop with that. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, for also giving a bit of an overview of what CDRI is and what it's trying to do. And I think trying to get these issues higher up the agenda and to the attention of, as you say, higher level policymakers is very important. And there is sometimes just a gap of awareness and a gap of knowledge there, and given what's at stake. And I think it's a really great work and great enterprise, and thanks for pointing out the study you've done recently on Odessa. I think that'll be very interesting to look at, and also interesting looking at the importance of design phase of these projects and how much risk gets locked in. And I think very important, especially in the context of talking about energy transitions and the kind of shifts and changes people want to see and are actually planning for. Makes it really important to consider these things, especially at this moment, I think, and in the next decade especially. So to close our panel, I'm very happy to also invite Carolyn Field to give also a different perspective. I think that will complement quite well a lot of the issues raised. She's Associate Director for Resilience, Security and Risk at Resilience Shift. She leads Resilience Shift's energy work. She's also an Associate Director at ARUP, and she focuses a lot on organizational and energy resilience, and has been working for a long time on a range of topics spanning building resilience, city resilience, infrastructure, and organizational resilience. And so we're really very happy to have you here, especially given you've been very active in developing standards when it comes to resilience. So pleased to have you, and I'll give you the floor.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sarah. Really pleased to be here. Fantastic session. So if I could have my slides up, that would be great. Wonderful. Thank you. So my name's Caroline Field, as Sarah mentioned, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about the work we've been doing at the Resilience Shift. So Resilience Shift, we're very much focused on creating safe, resilient and sustainable infrastructure. And we do that through our network of members, partners and collaborators, through influencing policy, shaping practice through like standards and guidelines, and through sharing learning, so very much convening our partners and people in the industry to share best practice. And I think, we've heard a lot today about obviously policy and why we need to do this, the need for it, and to a certain extent what needs to be done. And we're very much focused on trying to get things happening and catalyzing movement within the energy sectors and other sectors and across critical infrastructure. Last year, we performed a scoping study of the energy sector in terms of identifying these global key issues that everybody's sort of struggling with, and what we could do at Resilience Shift to support and facilitate that. And decarbonisation, not surprisingly, came up as one of the biggest global issues, although perhaps more surprising, less so climate adaptation. So there was definitely a real big focus on decarbonisation. And we were told we could help with that by helping to provide guidelines on how you would implement resilience, providing indicators and measurement to quantify the value of resilience, the business case for doing that, particularly for helping sort of regulators and energy companies for developing a strategy and the business case for that. And lastly, perhaps most importantly, as was talked about earlier, helping to bring together the kind of stakeholders across the sector together to kind of share, learn and influence together. And so that's a big piece that we do as well. We very much bring together and workshops and discussions around these key issues. So today I'm going to briefly discuss how we're supporting the energy transition and implementing climate resilience in the energy sector. So if you go to the next slide. So we're currently one of the projects we're working on right now is around climate resilience for infrastructure systems, and this is called our Infrastructure Pathways project. And this is actually through a coalition that we're currently chairing, which is the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure. And so we're putting this guidance together, and it's really, if you kind of look at the diagram here, it's about identifying all of the players within the value chain of delivering infrastructure and really helping provide tangible, practical advice about what needs to be done at each stage to kind of ensure climate resilience. So that's being put together at the moment, and we want to kind of make that really clear and really useful, and we're planning on putting that out just before COP26, so that'll be in a few months' time. Next. So the other area I mentioned was around measuring resilience, and so this is really talking to what Jin-sun was talking about earlier in terms of these indicators for resilience. And so we're kind of the next level down, and so we've worked both the ARUP and the Resilience Shift on the energy resilience framework, which is a maturity model, if you like, for the energy sector. So benchmarking best practice and saying what good looks like in the energy sector. And so we've kind of got three main areas we've been looking at. So around good practice around energy resilience for leadership and strategy. So thinking about how agile you are as an organization through to how you lead and how integrated your planning is for resilience, and obviously linking again to the policy and governance. And then thinking about sort of economy and societal issues. So engagement with customers, financial kind of systems and supports, and this whole systems thinking and effective disaster response. And then lastly, around infrastructure and ecosystems, which is where most people tend to focus, is around that infrastructure management, adaptive and integrated planning, and sustainable solutions. And so it's really trying to bring together all those areas and think about resilience very holistically. So this is actually for all types of hazards, not just climate, but obviously you can apply it for climate. And we're currently working with cities and grid operators using this framework to help them set a course for resilience within their organizations and industries. Next. And then lastly, I mentioned the importance, obviously, collaboration and sharing best practice. So one of the initiatives we're undertaking at the moment within Resilience Shift is to set up this global grid operators and distributors network. And so we're looking to kind of bring together about 15 of the kind of world's grid operators in a forum when they can share best practice, share challenges, and really provide that kind of coalition to help make change. This is very much focused around resilience and sustainability. And so we're really excited about this. So we're actually pulling that together right now with a kickoff for September. And we hope to do this across other sectors, but we're starting very much with energy, recognizing the massive amount of change that's happening within the industry over the next 10, 20 years. And really that need to kind of help facilitate that and to make sure that it's a resilient transition as we move towards decarbonisation and protecting ourselves from climate change. That's it. I'm really happy to take questions. Thanks.
Super, thanks so much. I think, yeah, really interesting to see kind of the issues that all these other actors in the field, those who actually have to implement and think about how they include this in their planning, what they need to deal with, and just sort of the nice kind of scope of the framework you presented and how broad it is, and also that it's applicable to climate, but it can be applicable to other resilience issues. And I think it's actually really nice to take frameworks that work and understand what are ways of thinking that can help us when it comes at looking at climate hazard and risk as well. So that's really interesting and a great initiative on the grid operators. Before I share some questions that we received from the audience, I just wanted to ask just maybe two questions to the panel. Maybe one from sort of your views on, as from a national policymaking perspective, either from experience or things that you've seen, really in terms of what are the main sort of difficulties, both when it comes to really identifying. I mean, a few people really made this point that like what's really important is actually having an assessment and being able to identify what these risks are, and then translating that into knowing what to do in terms of then thinking through what are the policy measures that maybe we will need, you know, as a government to implement, and so kind of what you see as key things that have been challenging, either in the identification or sort of the implementation, identification of risk and implementation of policy, one or both, and really in terms of how those have been addressed or what are things that have been able to shift and enable those. Please just raise your hand or yes, please, Lorena.
Thanks. Well, it may sound very basic or simple, but when you need to know what you are facing to before selecting how you are going to fight to. So our main difficulty when making the plan is the regionalization of the climate models. For example, at a local level, for example, at river basin scale. Very often, modeling provides inconclusive results at regional level, and that makes very difficult to adopt decisions or the most cost-effective decisions and measures. That's for us the highest difficult, because once you know that implementing measure is very related to mitigation measures, as I said before, so I think it's easier.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how, so if that was the main difficulty, what would you say was the enabled you to try and get a better sense of that assessment at the scale that was relevant?
How can we improve, or how can we overcome these difficulties are very related to the investigation, the research, the improvement of modeling in terms of regional statistics, of sharing data, and to be able to build more accurate scenarios. As I said before, more it could be good transfer of knowledge or sharing of data, especially in terms of modeling of climate models.
Sorry, Caroline, please.
Thanks. I was just going to do it from the perspective of, you know, where we sit. So essentially, obviously, we tend to be in a space between policy and implementation, and I think there is a bit of a gap there at the moment in terms of. So, for example, we have pretty good policy in the UK, for example, but that's not really kind of permeated down to sort of the regulator level, and so we've been kind of talking with the regulators, so with Ofgem in the UK, for example, about, you know. And I think one of the real key things here is learning from other sectors. So, for example, in the UK, the water sector was very forthcoming around resilience in general a few years ago, and they really wanted to see resilience in around this very much an integrated approach to resilience, and they sort of challenged the water companies to come up with that. And I sort of was challenging our energy regulator to do the same, actually, in terms of learning from what other sectors have done. So I think that's a really key point in terms of there are leaders and there are areas that we can learn from, and I think that's really important. And I think learning from what we've done in the water sector, we didn't have sort of a set approach or a set framework for measuring. And so when you know, all of the water companies came back, they'd all done something different, and I think that makes it very difficult as well in terms of you know, one company done this, it's very difficult for them to judge who was doing what and what best practice was. So I think that was one of the lessons I sort of talked about with them, was having a uniform kind of approach or framework way to be able to judge everybody in the same way was quite, I think, would be most helpful. So that's sort of where we are from our perspective certainly in the UK.
Thanks for that. Abhinash?
Thanks, Sarah. What I would like to add, in addition to what Caroline and Lorena have just highlighted, the communication also matters, and generating that empirical evidence for the particular sector, and in terms of what that sector lies in terms of what exactly is the impact and how that empirical evidence communication has to be done. Just to give an example, everybody knew that the eastern coast of India are quite vulnerable to cyclones. Right? Every year, cyclones do hit on a, earlier it was on an alternate basis, now on a yearly basis, at least 1 or 2 cyclones do hit it. And the first sector which has been ravaged is your critical infrastructure as well as your power sector infrastructures. Right? So everybody knew it, but until unless you create that empirical evidence in terms of loss and damages and how exactly that's going to impact, now everybody, this is a classic example what Samir actually gave about Kochi airport. Like you are dependent on solar panels, or you are dependent on your windmills, and basically your solar panels are inundated. You don't counter that risk. So communicating all those risks, and until unless we communicate properly, we can't bridge that gap. And coming to what Lorena said about the uncertainties across climate models, until now, all our climate models have been focused on a 2050 and 2100 scenario. And people, at least the industry sector, looks at near-term and short-term projections. They are not dependent on 2050, 2030, because their investment is going to happen here and now, right? So that's an important area to look at it. And more importantly is, again, those models, those complex graphs and maps that we create as climate researchers should be translated into palatable format. And that's one of the key areas. The second area is about connecting the dots between different siloed government functionaries, right? Disaster risk reduction cannot remain in the purview of only the disaster management authorities or environment issues within environment ministries. So the purview needs to be changed, and that cohesion needs to be brought into place. Then only probably we can look at the sector. I mean, whenever the national action plans have been built up, how many consultations do happen with the energy or the power sector in terms of climate proofing their assets or infrastructure? I think none of it, at least in India or across South Asian vulnerable countries. I don't think that happens, right? So this is where we also lag. So yeah.
Thank you. Very, very interesting points. Hannah.
Yeah, just I want to share the difficulty in South Korea. First, as you know, in order to understand the resilience of climate change, it is necessary to accurately identify the vulnerability and risk caused by climate change. We conducted very research about the resilience on energy sector, but it is still lacking comparing to other area. In Korea, we just focus on water and ecosystem and agriculture, something like that. It is, but on the energy sector, we didn't interested about the energy sector actually. Second, South Korea has announced the 2050 carbon neutrality, and various strategy and being established. And all interest and technology development are focused on carbon dioxide reduction, actually in Korea. And various action plans are being implemented through system and regulation for greenhouse gas reduction, but there is a lack of awareness and no consensus on the importance of the adaptation and resilience on energy sector. I think resilience on energy sector is also important issue. So we have to pay more attention and emphasize the importance. Also, for the resilience energy sector, we should make more consensus and do related research more and try to make a framework to enhance the resilience. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I think that was, it was really interesting, to sort of understand some of this lack of priority and awareness, and also the role that evidence, research, strengthening that can really play. to change that focus and change that priority, hopefully, and learning from what's been successful in other sectors that are also at risk and where you were trying to get policy attention on these issues. So I thought that was really interesting. I'll save my question perhaps, and I'll switch to perhaps asking some questions that we received from the audience, as we only have 15 minutes left in our session. So the first question is views on what's, and perhaps this is not a possible question to answer, I'm not sure, on what's the most important part of an adaptation plan for the energy sector. So if someone were to choose, you know, what's the thing that really should be there? So examples were a monitoring framework or reporting on progress, or is there sort of a key element or key elements that you would really sort of underscore as being essential to an adaptation plan for the energy sector? And I'll maybe ask a second question, and I'll allow people to take one or the other or both, which is quite interesting, which is, are questions of energy resilience fundamentally different in emerging economies? I assume from advanced economies. And if so, how can we approach resilience globally while acknowledging inequalities inherent to resilience and resilience policy? So, okay, I see Caroline and then Lorena.
Hi, thanks. If I take the first one, that's quite a difficult one, saying one thing. I mean, I do think it's important, if you're doing an adaptation plan, that you have a framework for measuring progress, and so you know where you are, where you start, and you know where you're going. I think there are also some real fundamentals when you're doing this type of thing, and so I'm writing some standards around resilience, and so we quite often talk about, you know, principles for resilience and things like systems thinking and making sure it's very much a systems approach to adaptation, understanding those interdependencies with, you know, people, with other systems, with, you know, and so I think that's a real core thing that needs to be part of that plan. So I could go on for some time about that, but I'll move to the second question. I think there are fundamentally different challenges, obviously, with different kind of emerging economies versus more developed economies, but I think the principles around resilience are pretty relevant across the board, but I think everybody's starting from different places, and I think the challenges are slightly different in terms of more mature systems. So for example, with developed countries like the UK tend to have very robust structures around how they implement policy and regulation around energy, and I think that makes it incredibly difficult for the new, more innovative players to come into the market. And I think that the structure of the industry is not necessarily set up for the amount of change that has to happen. So I think that's a specific challenge for kind of more developed systems, whereas I think more emerging economies can be a lot more flexible and adaptable and come in with new technologies and build new infrastructure. So I think there are different challenges of each, but I think the principles, you know, of resilience apply across the board, and I think having a sort of framework and guidance can be reasonably uniform. It's just we're all starting with slightly different places. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'll pass to Lorena and then Abhinash.
Thank you. Very briefly. For the first question, I think that the key issue for adaptation planning is to have a holistic approach between adaptation and mitigation, and with the other with the planning in the other sectors. For example, in Spain, very clear nexus to water planning, to tourism planning, to agriculture planning. That's the key issue for us.
Thanks. That's very clear. Abhinash?
I think I'll try to attend the second question about energy resilience, fundamentally different in emerging economies, right? And how do we acknowledge the inequality? So I'll say, in fact, give an example that energy access needs to be climate proof. That is more important, because you can't have different economies have different segment of energy access, right? And if you are living in a country, in a tropical country like India, where heat waves or your normal thermal comfort needs to be addressed at a larger cost, right? And if my thermal comfort zones are not right, then my energy dependency will increase. And if I can't have accessibility as well as the affordability to purchase that air conditioner in my house, then I am not in my thermal comfort zone. So it's going to again impact my health budget and health impact. So this is a nexus, very complex nexus, where the energy access need to be climate proof, where and we need to identify that, and different economies have got different priorities. So we need to identify it not just from a sector perspective, but from demand and supply perspective, looking at the economic strata of our majority of the population. And that's where the key lies in terms of creating that, what Lauren just referred to about creating that holistic approach can actually be addressed if you identify some of these key factors. Yeah.
Thanks. That's a very interesting point. Samir, did you raise your hand? Yes.
So yeah, the Avinash's point basically made me reminded me of the idea that there are lots of countries which have not yet built all of the infrastructure that they're going to build in order to achieve the SDGs. So in India, we say that the infrastructure, we're going to build more infrastructure in the next 20 years than we built in the last 200. It might be an exaggeration, but basically that goes to show that we have the opportunity now to get things right first time around. We don't have older legacy infrastructure that needs to be, reverted in order to move in a new direction. So for developing economies, definitely this is an opportunity, and the faster we can push national governments to take action, to take cognizance of this and take action on this, that's where the key is going to lie. We don't need to, the emerging economies are also waiting for inputs on how to take this forward. So that was one. And second, one of the discussions we're missing out here, because this reminded me, the emerging economies point reminded me, was the access to finance. And this is a key bottleneck for a lot of countries who do want to transition maybe, but don't have access to sufficient finance or methodologies on how to use that finance to make climate resilient infrastructure. So this is one gap that exists. Yeah, that's it from me.
Thanks. That's actually an interesting point. We actually recently, as the IEA, released a report on financing for clean energy in emerging and developing economies, and even just on mitigation, which is an area where there is more political focus potentially. There's huge challenges, and in practice, real issues with access and flows of resources. So I think bringing in that adaptation angle would be, again, something new to look at, and seeing specifically for energy. I think you're absolutely right that we'd likely see something very, very similar. There's another question that we received in the chat that will share. Perhaps people have different interpretations of it, but it's sort of on how you would use a tool like, say, the climate resilience policy indicator or some other types of indicators trying to show levels of preparedness or levels of policy readiness or implementation. How is that useful, or how do you think that would be used in your work and the work of your partners and organizations? Samir, I saw you raise your hand.
So right off, for us, this is very important. Studies like this are extremely important to advocate with countries to invest in climate resilience. So right off the bat, studies like yours, like CEW has published, this helps us to make the case to policymakers and government officials who are not cognizant of the issues, or are, so for example, power secretaries in India who have not, have heard of the climate issues, but studies which show in numbers what is the issue, they really help us in advocating for all this work.
Yeah, advocacy, raising awareness, that's great. And I suppose being CDRI, something that's perhaps cross-country or hopefully somewhat comparative perhaps is particularly useful. Did anyone else want to come in on that?
I can comment quickly, Sarah. I think the indicator list is quite comprehensive, broad-based, both what you, Jinsoon presented, as well as what Carolina also presented. That's a toe-eye view of what we call it as climate proofing of energy sector, I would say. But as a researcher who is trying to navigate that bridge through empirical evidence, I think this set of indicators creates a benchmark in terms of creating that empirical evidence as well, in terms of what is existing within the country's frameworks. Whether we talk of access to finance or to our preparedness or to our recovery strategy, or even to just climate proofing of infrastructures. Samir gave us the optics of what exactly we are going to build in India in the next 20 years is going to surpass our 200 years of work on infrastructure building. But at one side, it's an opportunity, but at the same time, it also creates that framework indicator to identify whether we are including it in our checklist or not. And that checklist is quite important, and getting a consensus on that checklist is quite important, because we might have our own set of checklists, CDRI might have, Carolina would have, or IEA would have, but getting that global consensus, and organizations like CDRI, IEA are going to play a pivotal role, I would say, in mainstreaming that, or standardizing rather those lists. And this is where I see it from that perspective.
Thanks. That's an interesting sort of clear sense of what the role of more international facing organizations can be. So thank you for that. We're almost out of time. So unless there's a panelist that really would like to share something that they feel they haven't been able to, and I'm sorry that if we weren't necessarily able to get through all the questions, but I'll just really like to thank everybody. I really learned a lot personally. I'm someone who's worked a lot on mitigation, and it's only been a few years that I've been really, with Jinsoon's help and other colleagues, really learning a lot more on this aspect of things. So every time we do this, I've personally found it very interesting, so important, and really interesting to learn just the different efforts, the different perspectives people are using, whether it's working with organizations, with grid operators, with governments, very ranged. Like we're working within one's own government to try and understand how to bridge these gaps. So I think very interesting, and I think to me, what really struck me is this idea of seeing things in a broader perspective, making sure things aren't happening in silos, really working to help bridge gaps between actors that should speak to each other, sectors that can learn from each other, and what we can do there. So for me, that's quite interesting, because I think that's something we've been really trying to do. Understanding what tools are useful, especially for raising awareness. I think something that also struck me was there is a bit of a lack of sometimes of priority and policy push on these issues, and there are ways to actually shift that and get people to focus and things that will help then lead to policy. But you do need a certain amount of knowledge, and perhaps, as Avinashi just said, a certain amount of consensus on certain issues, because as Caroline was saying, I think the framework and certain principles are really useful and broadly applicable. It's just then it's about people understanding how can they use those from their policy priority positions, which will vary, their starting points and their particular structures, which will vary. But some of those ideas and principles that a lot of people raised, and priorities, I think are common and useful to share and develop. So really wanted to thank you for those insights, for even more broadly the engagement with us and our work in this space. And just to note that again, this climate resilience policy indicator for us is a starting point for trying to help think through these issues. And we will be releasing a series of articles for each of our member countries, and eventually our association countries. That will be sort of a summary of applying this indicator to a specific country context. So that's something we're working on, and that we'll be releasing over the next few months. and hope that that's, as you say, an opportunity to sort of raise awareness and bring some more evidence and some more information about what countries are doing within their policy planning. So thank you so much for the discussion. I think we're really appreciate the speakers and the audience for their questions, and very keen to keep working with everyone on this important topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks
Please
very
stay
much.
safe and resilient. Yeah.